Okay, we are going to talk about one of the most important things for you to know, which is exposure. So if there's one video you understand, this is the one. Your exposure is the amount of light that reaches your camera's sensor. When it's too dark, it's referred to as underexposed, and when it's too bright, it's referred to as overexposed. So in order for you to know if your image is exposed correctly, there's a few tools in your camera that you can use. So as I turn my DSLR camera on, up pops my live view mode. Now this is the first tool you can use, which is simply just to go off of your eye to see if the exposure is correct. This method will generally work just fine, but if you are in bright conditions under the beating sun, it can be hard to get a correct reading on your LCD screen. So another tool that I like to use and would recommend you using as well is called your histogram. And you can find that by pushing this info button right here, and up pops your histogram in the right top corner up here. This white area is showing you a reading of the exposure in your image, and as your exposure gets too dark or underexposed, this white area will shift to the left of the chart, and this is telling you that your shadows are too dark. And as you overexpose your image, this white area will shift to the right and indicate that your highlights are too bright. So anytime this white area is flat up against one of the sides of the chart, it means that it's either too dark or too bright of an exposure. So the goal when reading this histogram is to try and keep all of the white area in the middle of the chart. Another good tool is your light meter that shows up on the bottom of your screen here. So as you can see, my light meter is reading perfectly exposed because it's in the very center. Now if I were to bring my exposure down, you see that that white bar goes down with it, telling me right now I'm 2 stops too dark. Or if I bring it up, now it says I'm 1 stop too bright. Now, these tools are reading the exposure of your entire image as a whole, so even though the light meter says the image is exposed correctly, you'll notice that my subject is too dark. So in this case, I would purposely overexpose parts of my image in order to properly expose my subject. So use the tools, but don't be afraid to override them if you want to expose for something specific in your image. Now let's talk about the 3 elements in your camera that affect your exposure. The 3 elements are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. There are 3 numbers that you see on the bottom of your LCD screen. Depending on your camera will depend on which buttons you use to adjust these 3 numbers. But on my Canon 5D Mark III, you use this top spin wheel to adjust the shutter speed, the big front spin wheel to adjust aperture, and you push the ISO button on top and then spin the top wheel to adjust ISO. So let's take a look at our first number here, which is your shutter speed. Now you'll notice that the higher my shutter speed is, the darker my image gets. This is what the shutter speed looks like at 1 full second and at 1/1000th of a second. Notice how much faster the shutter moves at 1/1000th of a second compared to 1 full second. Because it moves faster, it lets in less light, and this is what darkens your image. But besides just making your image darker or brighter, your shutter speed is affecting your motion blur. So take a look at this video clip shot at 1/30th of a second, and then the same clip shot at 1/1000th of a second. Pay attention to the movement of the lacrosse stick. At 1/30th of a second, there's a lot more motion blur in the image. Now look at the motion blur at 1/1000th of a second. There isn't hardly any motion blur at all. And when I look at individual frames, you see that each still frame is very crisp and sharp. This is what I mean by the shutter speed affecting your motion blur. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you will get. Now, a lot of people get confused about the difference between frames per second and shutter speed. So look at it this way. When you shoot 24 frames per second, your camera is taking 24 individual still images, or frames, per second that combine to create motion picture. And each of those individual images has its own shutter speed. So when you shoot 24 frames per second at 1/30th of a second shutter speed, each of those 24 images will have the motion blur associated with that shutter speed. Compare that to setting your shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second, and you'll see that even though the frame rate is still at 24, there's less motion blur because your higher shutter speed is affecting each individual frame. Now, the human eye sees motion blur in real life. So for example, put your hand in front of your face and wave it back and forth, and you'll see that your eye can see motion blur as your fingers cross in front of you. So to replicate the motion blur that is seen by the human eye, the rule of thumb is to always shoot a shutter speed twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then the rule is to have a shutter speed at 1/48th. But since most DSLRs don't have that option, the closest you can get is 1/50th of a second. And likewise, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you double it to 1/120th of a second shutter speed. Though this is a rule, I personally like to throw out the rule at times and shoot higher shutter speeds because I like the look of less motion blur as it allows for a cleaner, crisper image. So understand the rule, but understand when you want to break it as well. Element 2 is your aperture, and just like your shutter speed, when your aperture number is higher, it makes your image darker, and when the number is lower, it makes the image brighter. And that's because your aperture is controlling how open or closed your iris is. Just like the iris in your eye opens and closes according to how much light there is, so does your lens have the same function. So this lens I have on right now opens up to an f-stop of 1.4 to let in the most amount of light, and closes down to an f-stop of 22 to let in the least amount of light. Basically, the bigger the opening and lower the number, the more light it lets in. But more than just letting in more or less light into your image, your aperture is affecting your depth of field. Depth of field refers to the amount of background blur your image has. So at a low aperture like 2.8, it creates what's called a shallow depth of field, or a small range of focus, and the rest will be blurred out. Here's the same shot at a high aperture. You'll see that there's a much greater depth of field, or more of your image is in focus. I personally try to keep my aperture on the lower end when I'm shooting people or any subject that I want the viewer to be focused on and not be distracted by anything in the background. And for situations like wide landscape shots, I'll bring my aperture higher so I can get as much in focus as possible. You have to remember though, that as you raise your shutter speed or aperture higher, it lets in less light, so you'll have to lower the other number to bring in more light to keep your exposure right. And if you are in low light situations, or you want to have both your shutter speed and your aperture high, then you'll have to raise your ISO, which is your third element of exposure. But unlike shutter speed and aperture, when you raise your ISO, it makes the image brighter instead of darker. Now, the ISO affects quality of image. Generally, you want the ISO as low as possible for maximum image quality. For example, here's a video shot at 100 ISO, and the same image shot at 6400 ISO. As you can see, the higher the ISO, the noisier and softer the image becomes. Noise refers to all these moving dots of light in your image. Compare the two side by side and you'll see that the lower ISO has a cleaner, sharper image quality, and the higher ISO has a noisier and softer image. So you always want to keep your ISO as low as possible. The better your camera's light sensitivity is, the higher you can raise your ISO without getting too much noise. For instance, here's my T3i at 6400 ISO compared to my Canon 5D Mark III at 6400 ISO. As you can see, my Mark III looks way better at the same ISO, and that's simply because it's a nicer camera with better light sensitivity. In summary, these three elements, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, work together to determine the exposure of your image. If you guys have any other questions, let me know.